Hi, everyone. I think we'll get started. My name is Max Smith. I'm an associate director at the Rotman Institute of Philosophy. It's very nice to see you all here tonight. Welcome to the second installment. This was meant to be the third installment, but last week we had to cancel, unfortunately, of the annual library lecture series, the theme of which this year is ethical issues in artificial intelligence. For those who are unfamiliar with the annual library lecture series, each year the Western University's Rotman Institute of Philosophy organizes a public lecture series co-sponsored with the London Public Library and Western's Department of Philosophy to offer a series of public lectures every Thursday evening in October. This is the second, as I mentioned, in our 2023 series, with the final session comprising a panel on whether we can enhance the trustworthiness of AI through regulation, which will take place here next Thursday. Tonight, our distinguished speaker is Professor Joanna Redden. Joanna is an associate professor in Western's Faculty of Information and Media Studies, FIMS. She is the co-director of a new research center called Starling, Research for Just Technologies and Just Communities. She also co-directs the UK-based Data Justice Lab. Joanna researches the social justice implications of government uses of data systems, as well as data harms and ways to redress and prevent those harms. Her most recent book is the co-authored Data Justice, published by Sage in 2022. Prior to joining Western, Joanna was a senior lecturer at Cardiff University, and before that, an assistant professor at the University of Calgary. She's worked as a reporter, as well as a researcher in documentary television and in politics. So after Joanna's talk, there will be an opportunity for questions. I think Joanna will speak for 45 minutes or so, and then we'll jump into a Q&A, which I will moderate. Please come up to the front of the room where I will give you a microphone and you will be captured by the video, as this will be put on Rotman's website later this year. We ask that you keep your questions brief to provide maximal opportunity for all of those who would like to contribute and ask a question.
I was concerned about some of the issues that I was seeing historically be reproduced in contemporary data applications. And another, I guess, founding story for this project that began in 2016 was when I was giving a talk and I started talking about some of the concerns that I thought we should be paying more attention to as governments were increasingly making use of predictive analytics, artificial intelligence. Someone in the audience said, well, but have these concerns actually led to real-world harms? Have people actually been negatively affected? At that time, I knew that people had been negatively affected. There was a lot of really important work being done in the United States. But at that time, no one had compiled some of these examples, these real-world concrete examples of harm, to demonstrate why we needed to be paying greater attention to the way that government agencies, and in fact corporations as well, were making use of data systems. So that's the background story for this project. This project has led to several outputs so far, and the research is ongoing. It led to the data harm record, which is available online. The first iteration of the record was published in 2017. It was updated in 2020. It led to an article in Scientific American, and there's a chapter on data harms in the book that I just published with my Data Justice Lab colleagues. So some of the ideas behind the data harm record are that if we want to build societies that make use of data systems, as we're increasingly seeing is happening, and if we want to make sure that we build societies where we can all thrive, then we need to be paying attention to how people are already being negatively affected by the kind of data systems that we're seeing introduced. The idea behind the data harm record is that we should be paying attention to these harms. We should be looking at the various ways that people are being negatively affected so that we can gain a better big picture appreciation of what's happening on the ground, ideally so that we can avoid those kind of harms going forward, but also so that we can get a sense of where we are heading together in our societies and where we may need to change course in the future. Key questions are, how do the socio-technical transformations, how do the kind of data systems that we're building and that are affecting us, how are these impacting? impacting on people's rights, life chances, and well-being. Another founding idea of the data harm record related to my frustration. So my frustration, which continues, my frustration in 2016 was that when people were talking about big data, when they were talking about artificial intelligence, when they were talking about the ways in which kind of new and emerging tech was being used, the language that accompanied these kinds of ways of speaking was very often this: with big data comes great opportunity and also great risk. With artificial intelligence comes great opportunity, but also great risk. With ChatGPT comes great opportunity and also great risk. And from where I was sitting, looking at where and how people were already being negatively affected, I see this language of risk as being really dangerous and, in fact, enabling. Because as long as we talk about risk, we're talking about something that is future-oriented, about something that might happen in the future. Where from where I was sitting and lots of other people that I was reading, the harms were already occurring. And the problem is that people weren't paying attention to them. So the data harm record then begins from another position. It begins from the position that we need to be looking at what's happening on the ground. We need to be spending far more time carefully assessing how people are already being negatively affected, and we need to learn from this. The methods involved in this data harm record have been it's been a multi-methods approach. So one of the things that I've been doing and I've been doing with my colleagues is trying to see where and how people are writing about data harm. So this has involved media analysis, it's involved document analysis, looking at legal documents, government reviews, and audits. It's been looking at a lot of legal publications initially, articles being published in law journals, and then also looking at publications in other areas more recently. The data harm record has also involved case study investigations. So the idea behind the data harm record is to be empowered by what we learn, right? So the idea behind the data harm record is not to kind of simply map out, look at all these terrible things happening. In fact, the exact opposite. We know about some of the things that are happening because of the really important work that people on the ground are doing to mobilize, raise concerns, to challenge, to redress harms, and try to prevent harms. So the data harm record also has involved case study investigations. So this has meant interviewing people on the ground. We've been interviewing activists, public servants, and lawyers in order to learn from what they're doing, how they're trying to redress and prevent data harms. Okay, so quite broadly, I just wanted to throw up this definition. I realize this is not news to a lot of people in this room, but I think it's useful. So a lot of the systems that I'm going to be talking about today involve something referred to as automated decision systems. So these are any systems, software, or processes that use computation to aid or replace. I've got government decisions here, but it could be corporate decision making. So it's used to aid or replace human decision making, judgments, and these systems, the ones that I'm talking about today, impact opportunities, access, liberties, rights, and or safety. Automated decision systems, the one I'm going to be talking about, they involve using computing systems to predict, to risk assess, to score, to classify, or to recommend what the best decision might be in a given situation. What's emerging out of this work is also the importance of defining data harm. And what I'm arguing is that we need to really start pushing against the very limited way that harm is understood, and we need to be thinking about how data harms signify the way that harm, the ways that we understand harm are limited, right? So harm, in terms of a dictionary definition, often refers to physical or material injury, damages, and adverse effects. Harm in the kind of world that is emerging, this world we have increasing collection and use of data. Harm has been argued by legal scholars needs to be expanded to think about the ways in which data systems are impairing or setting the interest back of a person, a community, or a society. The idea here is that as a result of a data practice, we may see harms occurring, which means that a person, a community, or a society is worse off as a result of a data-related practice. Hoffman and Ahua argue that, in fact, the kind of harms that we're seeing occurring are so harmful it's actually more accurate to speak about data violence, because if we think about the ways that people are being wrongly denied access to the necessities of life, if we think about the ways that people are being held falsely in detention for extended periods of time, if we think about the kind of errors that we're seeing occurring, that what we actually see happening, what people are experiencing, is in fact data violence or algorithmic violence. Okay. If you look at the data harm record, you'll see that it's very long. And one of the things that we try to do with the data harm record, through compiling all of these examples, these real-world concrete examples of the negative experiences of people as a result of data practices that are being deployed, we've tried to categorize them in order to kind of identify the different types of harm that are occurring. But this is a difficult process because, of course, there's overlap. But just as an example, we're seeing exploitation. I'm going to give a specific example of data harms that are occurring as a result of exploitation in a minute. We're also seeing examples of discrimination. I'm also going to give an example of that in a moment. We're seeing loss of privacy. I'm not going to talk too much about that because I think when people think about what's going wrong in the ways that data systems are used, people are pretty aware of how privacy is being invaded through different kinds of surveillance practices. But I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. We're seeing harms that result in physical injury. I won't talk about this one, but I think this is increasingly important. So we're seeing people being injured because of the way that surveillance is being incorporated into workplaces. So just as an example, we're seeing delivery drivers, because of the way that their work is being monitored on a minute-to-minute basis, they're pushing themselves to work harder and faster than they're physically able to because of this constant surveillance that is the new reality of so many workplaces right now. We're seeing manipulation. This is something that I think many people will be aware of because of this. I would say this area of data harm has been in the news a lot lately. So we've seen this in relation to Cambridge Analytica. We've seen a lot of news come out of the 2016 American election and the way that micro-targeting of voters raised a lot of concerns about a lack of transparency or accountability in the kind of information being shared in an election, and the way that people's emotions were being manipulated through the use of certain kinds of targeting of information in order to amplify fear or in order to amplify hate. We've seen examples of exclusion from necessities of life. So there are examples here of where automated decision systems are being introduced, which replace human decision makers, that mean that people have been denied access to medical benefits, for example. I'm going to talk about another specific case here in a moment. And then we're seeing a range of injustices, which will also be clear in the examples I'm going to talk about. Okay, so I wanted to throw up, before we get into the case study investigations, I wanted to throw up a few examples from the data harm record, and we can talk about them in the Q&A. If you want to go online to the data harm record, you'll see hyperlinks to each of these case studies, and you can investigate them on your own. So in the upper corner here, we've got Pam Dixon testifying before Congress. Pam Dixon is an organizer for World Privacy Forum. One of the things that Pam Dixon did quite early on was raise concern about the kind of information that data brokers were collecting. So data brokers collect a lot of information that we provide, perhaps unknowingly in a lot of cases, as we participate on dating apps, or as we look up information online, as we communicate with certain websites. And one of the things that Pam Dixon was raising concerns about was the very detailed profiles that data brokers have about people and the ways that data was being compiled in order to target specific groups of people who it's perceived to have certain kinds of proclivities to be vulnerable in some cases. And so one of the things that Pam Dixon uncovered, for example, through just going online and looking at the kind of lists that these data brokers were selling, she found that data brokers, at the time that she was researching them, were selling lists of people they were suspecting were victims of sexual violence, addresses of domestic violence shelters, people who it was suspected were suffering from genetic disease and struggling with addiction. These are just some examples. The lists are long. And the data brokerage industry, despite years and years of researchers calling for more regulation and oversight, still remains a really murky industry, right? Huge problems there. Another area which relates to more recent work with my colleagues at Concordia and researchers I'm working with at in the Faculty of Information Studies at Western University. We're now updating the data harm record again with a focus on Canada. So we're looking at and trying to make visible the wide range of harms that Canadians are experiencing. And we're looking at some of the intersectional components of this. So we're looking at the ways that people are differentially impacted based on age, class, gender, ethnicity, et cetera. And so one area of harm that is really significant for Canadians relates to data breaches, right? And so one of the things that we're finding in our research, of course, is that millions and millions of Canadians are affected by data breaches. In fact, after the Office of the Privacy Commissioner made it mandatory for companies to report data breaches, in that first year alone, 28 million Canadians were identified as having been victims of a data breach. 600, I think the number is 600, there were 680 data breach reports, right? So this is an area that's not getting enough attention. And this also pushes the boundaries of how we understand harm. Because of course we know that a data breach can lead to identity theft, it can lead to fraud. But with a data breach also comes what my colleagues at Western, I'm working with some fantastic graduate students and undergraduate students, and some of the things that we're talking about is the way that people experience anxiety and stress, right? When you know that you've been a victim of a data breach, you don't know what to do or where to turn, although you're told that you should be protecting yourself more, right? And too often in the media reporting of this kind of issue, there's no solution provided. People are not given resources to protect themselves. Another data harm that we have identified in the data harm record relates to research done by ProPublica in the United States. And one of the things that they identified is the way that minority neighborhoods in the US are targeted with higher auto insurance rates than primarily white neighborhoods. And this is a huge problem if you think about North America, and so many people, particularly in rural communities, depend on their cars to get to work, right? And so what they were finding is that people in minority neighborhoods were paying more for car insurance rates. And if you're already living precariously and not making a lot of money, that means you're going to have to make sacrifices somewhere else to pay for your car insurance rates. And you don't have the option to take the bus. There's no public transit. So, and they found that people in minority neighborhoods in the United States, through their analysis, their car accident rates aren't any higher. And so one of the things that they point to is that, in fact, what this means then is that you have people in minority neighborhoods paying more for car insurance rates, which means people in white neighborhoods pay less. So you're also, with these kind of assessments of harm, you see the way in which there's advantage and disadvantage happening on the ground. We also see examples through uses of facial recognition technologies of people being wrongfully identified and wrongfully arrested. We're seeing more and more cases of this. This is leading to a lot of harm because sometimes it means that people are detained for long periods before the false arrest is dealt with. We see people losing, there's a case of a man losing his job because it took so long for this false arrest to be challenged. And then we see enormous impact on families, right? As a result of partners and children who get caught up in this situation. Okay, so I wanted to turn now to Joy Buolamwini, and I think that it's important for us to just take a minute and hear from Buolamwini, who's been doing hugely important work, raising awareness about why and how it is that facial recognition systems are so problematic, how they're so biased. And this work is also informing a lot of mobilization around the world. So what we're seeing as a result of the kind of work that Timnit Gebru and Joy Buolamwini have been doing is that we have a lot of mobilizing to preemptively ban uses of facial recognition technology so that the kind of harms that we're seeing happening won't occur.
Hi, I'm Joy, and I research how computers detect, recognize, and classify people's faces. In my TED featured talk, I spoke about my experience with the coded gaze, my term for algorithmic bias. The system I was using worked well on my lighter-skinned friend's face, but when it came to detecting my face, it didn't do so well, until I put on a white mask. After my talk was posted, I tested my speaker image profile across different facial analysis demos. 2 of the demos didn't detect my face. The other 2, well, they misgendered me. The demos didn't even distinguish between gender identity and biological sex. They just provided 2 labels, male and female. Now I wanted to see if these results were just because of my unique facial features, or if this was something that was more of a pattern across other faces too. So I began a project that became my MIT thesis, Gender Shades, or the long title, Gender Shades, Intersectional Phenotypic and Demographic Evaluation of Face Datasets and Gender Classifiers, or just Gender Shades. I wanted to see how well different gender classification systems worked across different people's faces, and if the results changed based on somebody's gender or their skin type. I created a data set of over 1,000 images of parliament members ranked among the top 10 in the world based on their representation of women in power. To get at a range of skin types, I chose 3 African countries and 3 European countries, so I could see how the system performed on lighter skin and darker skin. Then I chose 3 companies to evaluate, IBM, Microsoft, and Face++, which has access to one of the largest data sets of Chinese faces. So now with the data set and the companies, I decided to run a test. The companies appear to have relatively high accuracy overall. Microsoft performed best, achieving 94% accuracy on the whole data set. All companies performed better on males than females, and all companies also performed better on lighter subjects than on darker subjects. When we analyzed the results by 4 subgroups, we saw that all companies performed worst on darker females. IBM and Microsoft performed best on lighter males, and Face++ performed best on darker males compared to the others. IBM had the largest gap in accuracy, with a difference of 34% in error rates between lighter males and darker females. I was surprised to see multiple commercial products failing on over 1 in 3 women of color. In fact, as we tested women with darker and darker skin, the chances of being correctly gendered came close to a coin toss. While more research is needed to explore the specific reasons for the accuracy differences, one general issue is the lack of diversity in training images and benchmark datasets. Failure to separate accuracy results across traits like gender and skin type also makes it harder to identify differences. Companies should do better with commercially sold products, especially since the machine learning techniques that have made gender classification possible are applied to other domains of computer vision, like facial recognition, and other areas of artificial intelligence. like predictive analytics. Predictive systems can help determine who is hired, granted a loan, or what information a particular individual sees. These data-centric technologies are vulnerable to bias and abuse. As a result, we must demand more transparency and more accountability. We have entered the age of automation overconfident yet underprepared. If we fail to make ethical and inclusive artificial intelligence, we risk losing gains made in civil rights and gender equity under the guise of machine neutrality. The coded gaze reflected in the Gender Shades project must be faced.
So the bottom line, across the data harm record, what we see, as stated by Virginia Eubanks, these systems are impacting all of us, but they're not impacting all of us equally. I want to turn now quickly, I'm going to end on time, I've got about 15 more minutes. I want to provide a couple of case studies for you, and then talk about what people are doing in response to this in a little more detail, and what are some of the things we can be doing. How do we go from data harm to data justice? My first case study involves robo-debt in Australia. When I started the data harm record, this was one of the cases I was looking at, one of the cases that involved looking at documents but also interviews. And I want to describe for you a little bit about what was going on here with the robo-debt case study. Okay, so in 2016, the Department of Human Services and Centrelink, which manages social security payments in Australia, changed the way that it identified people who had been overpaid their benefits. The new method meant fortnightly earnings every couple of weeks could be used to estimate annual earnings. Now, this is a problem for people who work precariously or who work seasonally, who are students, who work part-time, or who have poor health because of the way that income in these cases fluctuates, right? The automation of system was another change. So what happened in this case also is previously, when someone had been flagged as potentially having been overpaid their benefits, a human would investigate this case. What changed is the human was removed, that the system was automated, debt notice letters were sent out to individuals who were falsely flagged. At one point, the system went from sending out 20,000 debt notices a year to 20,000 a week, right? And so what also happened in this case is that it became the responsibility of the person receiving the debt notice to prove that they had been overpaid their benefits. This was a significant challenge because if you got one of those debt notices, you would have to call Centrelink and you might have to spend hours online before, like on the phone, before you could get a person. And people who are working precariously, people with health conditions, people with childcare commitments, people with any kind of living situation that we all have, it's very difficult to stay on the phone for hours at a time. If you could get someone on the phone, people who did manage to do that reported that in some cases they weren't even able to find out what it was that had led to this flag, right? They couldn't figure out the information they needed to challenge. So in response to this, a number of people, because there were thousands and thousands of people affected, they began to mobilize. And what they did is they started a campaign called Not My Debt. There were huge groups of people affected by what was happening in this case, people with a range of skill sets. And so the organizers in this case, they set up a system whereby some people would investigate, they do some investigative work and share what they found out. They created the Not My Debt website where they made it possible for people to share stories anonymously about what their experiences was. They mobilized, so they had people who could speak with journalists to kind of get the word out, try to get some media coverage, try to get some journalists on the case to investigate what was happening. And they were able to get a significant amount of media coverage. They also lobbied politicians, which led to several government reviews. One of the things that came out in all these investigations was how often people were being sent debt notices in error. And in the process, people's lives were being destroyed, right? For people already living paycheck to paycheck or struggling with health conditions, being hounded by debt collectors created intense stress and anxiety. Asher Wolf, one of the organizers here who I interviewed, described the system, which was labeled Robodebt, as an algorithmic weapon of calculated political cruelty because of the negative impact it had on those falsely accused and because of the way it disproportionately targeted the unemployed, disabled people, single parents, caregivers, casual and gig economy workers. All this happened despite, as Simon Williams argues, and those developing the system would have known, there were bound to be errors. With any sort of automated system, there are going to be errors, right? And yet protections weren't put in place to ensure that those who were falsely flagged would be able to respond and seek redress. Instead, Dan Nicholson, who I interviewed, who worked for Victoria Legal Aid, which mounted a legal challenge eventually when they were able to, argue that what we see happening with this system is a shift, right? We have a shift happening here where the state is putting the onus on the individual who has limited means and limited resources to prove their innocence, right? Instead of the state being obligated to prove guilt. Now, eventually what happened, years later, after all of this, the system was finally canceled. Another project that I recently was working on with my colleagues involved investigating canceled systems. And there's important lessons to be drawn for this. So we are seeing, as with Robodebt, there was a similar system to this put in place in Michigan in the United States, also recently canceled. We're seeing now more and more systems being canceled, but of course finding out about these things is very difficult because you don't know where they're being employed in the first place. There's no register, which is one of the problems, which we'll talk about later. Anyway, this system was canceled after much review, and the government agreed to pay out $1.2 billion to settle a class action lawsuit. Great human cost, great financial cost. It was suggested at one point that anywhere from 600,000 to 900,000 of these debt notices had been issued and would need to be reassessed. There were huge errors in this case. The other case I want to talk about quite briefly involves home care in Arkansas. In Little Rock, Arkansas, right around the same time, 2016, the Department of Human Services in this case tried to change the way it went about calculating how many home care hours people were going to receive. In this case, the department decided an algorithmic system would assess need and make the ultimate decision about how many home care hours someone would receive. Where a home care nurse in this case used to previously go visit people in their homes and make an assessment, in this case, the home care nurse would go to someone's home and help them fill out a questionnaire with 280 questions. The answers would be calculated, and then out would come a number of hours that was recommended to this person in terms of home care hours. The nurse didn't have the ability to challenge the system, right? What people started raising concerns about is that, in fact, huge numbers of people were seeing their home care hours cut significantly. In many cases, this meant that people would either have to experience a great deal of suffering because they'd have to languish in their beds for extended periods of time, or they could no longer be in their homes at all. Here, a number of people who were experiencing these cuts to their home care hours, they reached out to Legal Aid of Arkansas. Legal Aid of Arkansas began investigations. One of the things that the lawyers involved in this case, Kevin DeLeban, found, and he had to go through enormous hoops in order to get access to the algorithm, like a judge had to order that. So the Department of Human Services was taken to court. The judge at one point ruled that the Department of Human Services had to make the algorithm that was being used in this case available. The lawyer in this case was not a computer scientist, didn't have any special skills, but just went through it painstakingly. And one of the things that he identified when I spoke to him quite early on is that there were problems with the system. So one of the things that they identified is that the system didn't seem to be able to accurately identify or assess people with cerebral palsy or with diabetes. Eventually, through much, again, political mobilization on the ground, through legal challenges, this system was stopped, but it was replaced by another problematic algorithmic system that is being challenged now in court still. More recently, we have a system in the Netherlands called System Risk Indication, or SIRI. It was a system that ran under the Ministry of Social Affairs and Employment, aiming to assess risks of welfare abuse or tax fraud. This system, which assessed huge numbers of people, was deemed to be unlawful when it was challenged in the courts by, again, a coalition of lawyers, community organizations. The system was deemed to be unlawful and not compliant with the European Convention on Human Rights. In the research that we've been doing on canceled systems, we're seeing the really important role that community organizations, that journalists, that legal aid organizations and other lawyers, that civil servants, those responsible for auditing and review, are playing in this kind of world that we're now part of, right, where we're seeing the increased implementation and use of some of these automated systems. So the systems that we found canceled, we found that often a range of factors are leading to cancellation in concert, which have to do the work that people are doing on the ground. So this can be civil society critique and protest, critical media investigation, legal action, government review, etc. Okay, I've got 4 minutes left, and this is meant to be a page that we can maybe talk through in the Q&A if you want to. I can leave it with you. So what do we do? Well, there's no shortage of ideas about what to do about these kinds of systems. So we have researchers that are arguing for more reflexive data science, to thinking about how we should be using data science differently. Maybe we need to have data science that incorporates more transparency, more explainability, more reflection, and moves a little slower. We have people arguing for data systems to be audited across the lifespan and across the cycle of particular data systems. In a number of the cases that I've talked about today, in most of the cases in the data harm record, and there are a lot of cases, it's very common for there not to have been any effort to investigate the impact these systems would have on the people who were going to be affected by them before they were implemented, or even on the decision makers who are going to use them, right? So that's just one example of the way that things could be done differently. We have a lot of ideas about how our democratic systems, our institutions need to change, because of course they're not keeping up or keeping pace with these systems as they're being introduced, right? Even now, we have the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act being considered by the Select Committee in Parliament. The Artificial Intelligence and Data Act is saying that most of the oversight is going to affect something that they're calling high-impact systems, which we are apparently going to learn more about at the regulatory stage. We don't know exactly what that's going to mean. A lot of the systems that show up in the data harm record, nobody would have identified as high impact before they were implemented, right? Who gets to decide what's high impact? Further, the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act is not going to apply to government systems, the ways that governments are using systems, which is a huge problem, because a lot of the harms that we're seeing are as a result of government uses of specific systems or public-private partnerships. Okay, so there have been calls for mandatory public registries. We don't know where and how these systems are being used. People have been calling for public registries for years. There's an overwhelming chorus of people saying governments should be posting registries of where and how these systems are being used. There are legal challenges. There are a number of organizations around the world mounting strategic litigation to demonstrate that the legality of these systems is not yet proven. The legal basis upon which many of these systems are being used is not yet proven, and these systems are being challenged effectively in the courts on different legal bases. There's calls to resource and empower regulators, for example, privacy commissioners, so they could preemptively investigate systems instead of reactively investigating them after a lot of harm has already occurred. There's calls for greater responsibility and accountability, and responsibility that would extend to those who want to implement these types of systems being sure to be responsible for the way these systems have caused harm in other places. So what we're seeing is that often a system that is causing harm has also caused similar harm in another place, right? So, you know, the idea being put forward here is that if you're going to suggest that you want to use a particular kind of system, you should have to acknowledge how that system has affected people in different parts of the world. Others are arguing the importance of refusal. So we need far more widespread discussion we all should be part of about discussions about if, where, and how these systems should be used, and that communities, people who are going to be directly affected by these systems, should have rights of refusal, which means that maybe we should be talking more about where we have no-go areas, where the risks, in fact, are so great that we don't want to see automated decision-making systems deployed in those areas. Some are recognizing the importance of dissent. So here we have a call for the need to invite external critique. So if a government agency, if a corporation is suggesting that they're going to use a system that is going to affect all of us and has the potential to negatively affect us, external critique should be invited rather than avoided, right? There have been calls for national algorithmic safety boards. There's been calls to revitalize democratic processes. A lot of the systems that are leading to harm are part of much longer histories that relate to systemic injustice and inequality. And these systems then are exacerbating and accelerating systems of injustice, right? So that people who are calling for a revitalization and a rethink of democratic processes are calling for things like people's councils and extended peer reviews so that we have a wider group of people at the table. We have more debate and more discussion, particularly discussion that includes people who have experience with fighting discrimination and injustice and understand how it gets embedded in data, but also in institutional processes. There is a lot of work in mobilizing happening on the ground all over the world. So we have tech justice organizations linking with social justice groups. People are calling for a need to rethink the logics that are informing these systems. These systems are often being employed in ways to target, so to either identify people and exclude others, or they're being used in ways to provide or ration already limited resources, right? So there's a logic of scarcity and austerity at work. So these systems are being used under the guise of efficiency and productivity, but often lead to people getting less. All of this would involve challenging normalization. So these systems are already being introduced and implemented, and the danger is that we just come to accept these things because they're here, right? And so by looking at the ways in which people are already being negatively affected in such a widespread way, ideally we challenge and confront the normalization of these systems. There are calls for politics of care, which is a rethink. So this would involve thinking about, instead of these systems which often distance, they reduce, they abstract, they simplify people's complicated realities, experiences, and relationships. So instead of that, groups are calling for a need for a different kind of politics, one that recognizes our interdependence to each other, but also to our communities and our environment. And then there are calls and a lot of work being done in the area of data literacy. So thinking about how it is that we talk about this in more meaningful ways, how it is that we engage others in these conversations, how we move toward greater accountability and prevention. Happy to talk about any of this with you. Thank you, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Joanna, for a very lucid and stimulating and somewhat scary talk. Happy to take questions from the floor. Just I ask for you to wait for me to give you the microphone so it can be captured on video, but please. Yes.
Thank you. So my question, I guess, is how do we protect ourselves? Like right now, you know, I can put extensions on my browser, use VPNs, you know, put nonsense searches into Google so I don't get like siloed. But with bigger and bigger systems, where do we get our protection? Like how much can we do for ourselves?
So I think there are different things we can do. I think one of the problems is that most of the focus is on how we can protect ourselves individually. I mean, even the current legislation being reviewed, and that's a huge problem. So there are ways that we can protect ourselves individually. We can try to prevent our data being collected by certain organizations. But if we think about the various applications that I was talking about today, if we think about data brokers, right? If we think about the ways that systems are being deployed in ways that we might not be aware of until after the fact, I think we need to be mobilizing. I think we need to be talking to others. I think we need to be organizing. I think we need to be asking far more of our political representatives. I think we need to be reaching out to those political representatives. I think we need to be holding more meetings like this, and perhaps part 2s and part 3s of meetings like this. And I think, that this is, and we don't have to reinvent it, because we're seeing different communities doing this all around the world. So if we think about what happened in Los Angeles and the work that the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition has been doing in Los Angeles, one of the things that they were doing was that they were gathering together and having community meetings about a system that was negatively affecting people in their community, right? So there are several steps to this. I think we need to investigate, and we need to kind of ensure that we know where and how systems are being used. I think we need to call for protections that go beyond kind of things that we do ourselves. We need systems of oversight, and I think we need to be talking a lot more about this. So, yeah.
Thank you. Other questions? Yeah, Mike.
Can I ask you some more analytic question? So there seem to be two different things that are potentially harmful here. Data aggregation per se, and then the algorithmic or AI use of those data once collected. Can you tease apart for us what those different risks are? Because I would imagine there are different responses to those two different things.
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that I try to do with this work is I try to present examples of harms that are occurring as related to different kinds of data practices, because I also think it's a problem that too often we talk about harms as related to a specific kind of application, whereas I see a lot of these applications existing on a continuum over time. So I'll just give you an example of that. So some of the research that we were doing in the United Kingdom involved looking at or trying to identify where and how local authorities were making use of data systems. And we identified different kinds of data systems. One type of data system was exactly as you described initially, was the example of an integrated data set. So there was a very careful and cautious work being done to responsibly work with data, right? So you had a local authority where people were involved in trying to combine different data sets. They got out and sought approval from those who held different kinds of data, and they create a very responsible system of oversight whereby anytime anybody wanted to use that integrated data set, they had to seek approval from those who had contributed their data, whether it's health data or some other type of location-specific data or service use data. And everybody who had contributed that data had veto power. They had a power to say that they would withdraw their data if they didn't want their data used. That's a rare case in my experience in the kind of data systems that we looked at. And they were using that data in order to anticipate future need. The big thing they wanted to do was anticipate, because they had an aging population with different issues facing aging communities, they wanted to anticipate what kind of need their local community was going to face going forward so that they could resource for it properly. But once that data set was compiled, then the government agency involved in that, and I can't find out much about this, but then you had the repackaging that into an integrated data set too, and you had a multinational corporation come in and I don't know how that is all working, right? But you can see that once you build an integrated data set with the best of intentions, and you create what they call a data warehouse or a data lake, there's no guarantee to what purpose that data set is going to be used going forward or how that might change, and function creep comes in and happens, and we've seen that in so many of the cases. So another example, I guess, would be predictive analytics. Data used in child welfare, right? So we saw an aggregated system that was developed that was used to enable social workers to share information in real time more quickly and efficiently so they could get a better sense of a family need, ideally to target them with resources and services. In another case, you had an aggregated data set that was related to family and children that is used to predict who it is who might be most likely to abuse or neglect their children, right? With neglect being a huge issue in the UK, particularly in England, because of all the cuts to social services, right? So, okay, so, and then you have the kind of harms that we see occurring as a result of the way that systems are used to flag people for being risky or being overpaid benefits or something like that, and then so there's so many different examples, and I take your point, but I find it, having looked at these things over a number of years, I find it, whereas I would have initially, I was doing that separation, but seeing the way these systems roll out over time, it's really difficult to say that this could be okay, because yeah.
One of the, in some of the stories, one of the positive things is just getting people to pay attention to it and to make it clear this or that is wrong. And that at least is the beginning of how the more general kind of fixing it. And so I guess I want to, certainly your work is doing some of that, but is there a more large-scale increase in the awareness of these problems, and that could be developed, and how would we go about doing that?
I think you've seen some of that happen in the United States around facial recognition technology. So I think you've seen the way in which Bulamuni and Gebru have done their research, and then they've communicated their research across different contexts and in different settings. Their research has been picked up by journalists. Their research they've really worked on grassroots mobilization and worked with organizations to communicate research findings in different kinds of ways, but also there's been a lot of working with communities who are raising concerns about specific kinds of applications. And so I think this comes down to communicating about what's happening on the ground, communicating in different ways to reach different audiences, and then doing something with that information. And so what's happened in the United States, when we were looking at canceled systems, we saw a number of cities preemptively banning the use of police use of facial recognition technologies, right? So that knowledge is being mobilized by community members in particular places who go to town council meetings or city council meetings, and who work on, getting people to those meetings to say, we don't want this type of application in our city because we see this happening here, there, and there. So, there are examples of that. So I think critical media coverage, I think talking to people, I think communicating research findings in different ways. I think real world examples make a lot of difference. Yeah, and I think thinking, we're certainly thinking about, how you share information, how you write about it, how you make videos about it, how you talk about it, how you meet with people. I mean, we're meeting with people, sharing information. Yeah.
Yeah, please.
One thing that would be great is to look at some positive examples. I mean, you did start doing some of that, and really focus on what this or that community did to make things better. And some of the stuff you were talking about, some of those examples seem like pretty good cases. And maybe how they did it would be something to sort of push.
It's a great idea.
Other questions? Yeah, please. Sorry, here and then here.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. It's really interesting and really important work.
I'm having trouble hearing you.
Oh, sorry, I'll speak up. But so yeah, thank you for the presentation. And I'm just interested to hear a bit more about those no-go areas. So what are some of the areas that we shouldn't want any data systems operating in?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that if you're dealing with an automated decision-making system that is that is determining someone's access to like Medicaid in the United States. So we had automated decision-making systems being put in place that would determine someone's ability to get medical services or to get drugs, right? I mean, that would be a no-go area. I think police use of facial recognition technologies would be a no-go area because of the kind of harm that we're seeing, of course, and because these systems are so flawed. And then I think that there might also be a lot of discussion about whether and how, or if even, these kinds of systems should be used in areas that would influence decision-making around families, like in children, right? And so in child welfare, I think there's a lot of important discussions to be had about that as a no-go area. Housing. I mean, should we be having these systems being used in determining who is a good tenant or a potential good tenant or not? Should these systems be used in hiring, right? Like we have some facial recognition systems being used to assess job applicants, and we know already the problems with these kinds of systems. Should these systems be used to sort resumes and CVs? They've been shown to be biased in these contexts. Should these systems, given the kind of fraud detection issues I was flagging and the ways these have led to harms in different countries already, fraud detection is definitely an area that I think there needs to be a lot more discussion and consideration. So yeah, I think there are a lot of areas we could be talking about in terms of no-go areas.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you for your contribution. Data harm is probably harming all of us as we speak. There's not many people who haven't been harmed, even on a simple level, through private organizations, Google, Microsoft, never mind government records and government and financial institutions that ding us for charges and negative harms that are in small amounts that we may not even notice, but on a societal level are probably running to the millions and billions. And who hasn't been harmed when they've been bumped from a flight because of some algorithm that determined that they may or may not, their luggage may or may not make it. So we've had various harms, never mind the real harms that you were discussing. And the one questioner that highlighted differentiating between data collection and then data interpretation and implementation of an algorithm to produce either good or harm. Is there a system for determining whether the data collection and the data use is being used to good or to with good principles? In other words, is there a system for evaluating whether data will be used for harmful purposes or can have unintended harmful impacts, or whether it could be good? Because there's no question we cannot live in today's society without data collection and data usage. Otherwise, we'll be in the situation where let's all silo ourselves, move into a bunker and have no data collected. And there, the libertarians would argue that all data collection is bad and let's avoid all data. What system would you like put in place, or are there systems in place for establishing these principles of good data usage?
Well, I think there are a range of people providing, producing, and writing about data ethics frameworks. There are people producing principles. Federally, there's an automated decision-making directive. There's an impact assessment. One of the challenges with this, or these approaches, is that it is often left to those who want to implement the system to make the decision about whether or not it's a good practice or a bad practice, whether or not it's going to potentially cause harm or not. In many of the cases that I've talked about, at least initially, and that are in the record, I don't think that people expected there to be harm, right? There are significant blind spots because those developing the system don't have much experience with the way that, or have not experienced discrimination or oppression, may not understand the way that these systems, these things get embedded in processes. So people at the decision-making tables around applications have blind spots. It's just one part of it. Another part of it is the kind of data that we have, which is data that comes from this very unequal and unjust world that we live in, and a lot of this data is informing the kind of systems, the way that systems work, right? And then there's the ways in which these systems are put to use. So in the systems that we've looked at that were canceled, for example, and again, this is hard and time-consuming because there are no registries about it, where and how these systems are being used. So you have to do a lot of digging to find that out in the first place, let alone to find out where they're being canceled. But the systems that we identified that were being canceled, we found systems that were being used in areas of justice, so policing and the law, areas of child welfare, fraud detection, so benefits administration in some way, and also to a lesser extent, education and immigration. And if you think about those areas, those are all areas where there's already a lot of injustice and inequality. So the kinds of systems that we found being implemented, they're being implemented in some ways to manage or or determine access to people's access to certain things. I mean, the kind of question you're asking, I think, also ties to this question of data for good, and is there a way in which that we could be using data systems differently to do different kinds of things, and how might we do that? And I think there are people who are putting forward really interesting ideas about, instead of using data systems to kind of limit or deny people things or make decisions about who's risky or not, maybe we could be using, this is one of the ideas being put forward, maybe we could use systems to identify people in need, people who don't have access to something to services that they need. But that would depend, I suppose, on a different kind of understanding, right? A different logic informing the uses of these systems, which wasn't about scarcity and austerity and cutting, but more about, ensuring people had what they needed, which is a different approach. So I'm not saying that, and there are systems that have been designed to try to do things differently with certainly really positive intent, right? To make systems more fair. There are people trying to develop systems to make current processes more fair. And there's a lot of research out there on that. There's a lot of people talking about how to do data, good things with data. But yeah, I'm really worried. I am seeing all that is going wrong, and so at what point, until there's more oversight and there's more regulation and there's more public participation and there's more widespread decision making about these practices, I don't know that I want to see more. There's already so much harm happening, right? So.
Yes, please.
Hi, thank you for that. That was really, really amazing. My question is about facial recognition technology, particularly the fact that in the People's Republic of China, their facial recognition technology is far more advanced than ours by like 5 or 10 years. And now they've acquired TikTok, and this has been one of the big diplomatic issues of the present era, is that many, like the teenagers of the world are basically giving them their facial recognition data, and because they have less regulation on this aspect there, their technology can do things that ours can't. So my question for you is, when you have like all of these really great recommendations that you're making in a world where they are implemented in certain jurisdictions, how do we deal with problems where in another jurisdiction that regulation is just not a priority for them, and they develop technology that then comes and just completely takes over the population in a globalized world?
It's a huge issue. So this is also something that I guess we've been thinking about at the lab in terms of organizing and sharing information. So of course, one of the issues and one of the problems I think that's really important is that you have companies and developers operating internationally, and they're able to deploy, similar kinds of systems in different parts of the world, and yet you have, the people experiencing these systems often existing within within a localized community in place, right? So, I think there are efforts of and by civil society organizations to research at a global level, to research what's happening in different countries and in different places, and to share that information, right? I mean, just one example is Amnesty International, who's been doing a lot of research on the ground. Amnesty Tech has been researching the way that systems are being developed and used in different countries, and some of the harms that are occurring, and trying to use that to share knowledge globally. I think that we have to be thinking about coming together internationally, politically, around these issues, right? I mean, we have, although not as effective as we might like, we have international meetings on climate change, right? We have international meetings on human rights, and we have, there are already frameworks that can be employed to enable, debate at a global level on these issues. So first, as a start at a response to that question, but it's a huge issue.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Is it Joanna?
Yeah.
Oh, anyhow, my name is Federico, and there were certain things that you mentioned that got my attention, such as if we were able to see some of these things happening ahead of time, how wonderful it would be. Well, some people told us in detail about where things are going to go. They start early in the 20th century, for example. Mike should be asking a question, shouldn't I?
Yes, please. Yes.
But okay, yeah. I would like to know, are you familiar with the work of Aldous Huxley?
Yeah, I love Huxley.
Aldous Huxley and I used to write to each other. I was trying to be a writer, so I sent some things for him. What's your opinion on this? And he says, well, your ideas are good, but your skill at the writing itself needs a lot of practice, he said. But anyhow, in 1935, I guess you're familiar with the book he wrote, Brave New World. Everybody thought that was great. They liked the entertainment, fact fiction. And in 1954, he had to rewrite the book. Do you know why he had to rewrite the book?
I read the rewrite, but I can't remember why he had to rewrite.
Brave New World Revisited in 1954. The reason he said that he had to rewrite the book is that things that he was forecasting or prophesying, wish, for the 31st century were happening 10 times faster than they imagined because technology was advancing at faster and faster rates. So in the second book, if you don't mind my explaining this, there's no storyline, no fact fiction story. He just simply outlined 4 specific dangerous areas that human beings are falling into, such as overpopulation, overcontrol, like in globalization. And he mentioned something about how the mind works in another aspect. Anyhow, he spoke in detail about 4 major things. And he said, unless we do something very drastic with these problems, we're heading for total slavery, such as technocracy, such as all this stuff that you say, because our politicians don't want transparency. They hate it. They don't want honesty. And they don't want necessarily justice if it makes them look good.
The floor washrooms will be closing in 15 minutes.
But anyhow, so there has been such a person as that. At the time, he was called one of the world's 4 wisest men. Okay? And I was very young when I read him, and it was very interesting. And eventually, after a few more years of research, I wrote to him a couple of times, and he responded. And he said he couldn't write to me too often because he was legally blind. I don't know if anybody knows that. Somehow he got his work done. But anyhow, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with people from the East, such as Paramahansa Yogananda. No? In the 20th century, he was one of the world's greatest educators. When he started schools, British didn't bother him. He started schools in India when he was a young man. And first thing he did was get rid of the European curriculum because there was no morality in it, no character building. So.
Do you have a question, sir, for Joanna?
Pardon?
Do you have a question for Joanna?
Yeah. Well, my question is, why don't we do some research into some of the people that told us where it was going who were correct? Okay, I just gave one example. 2 examples. Who were correct, and maybe they gave some suggestions. Well, he did in his book Island, how we can upright this problem, okay, instead of getting into technocracy. And so maybe we could discuss some individuals, your favorite, his favorite, doesn't matter, and see where they were trying to take us. And maybe we should go back and see they've got political science behind them after all these years as to they were correct. Now, in the early 20th century, say around 1920, would you see that all this advancing technology, would you see that it was going to lead us to around the corner now is total human slavery? We thought the UN's going to save the world. It'll maybe help stop a lot of wars. But now they want to control everything. No more elections. We'll just decide who's going to do what. We'll make like in the new Declaration on World Health. We'll make the declarations, and everybody that's signed up in the UN, they have to follow these declarations. No more politician deciding this or that. That's only one area.
So maybe I'll ask Joanna to respond to your question.
Thank you very much.
Get a couple more in, but thank you very much.
Yes, I think. Well, I love Huxley. I love that book, and I think there's a lot of lessons in that book. And I think thinking about and looking at what we can learn from literature is really important, and thinking about not just the content, but also ways of writing, ways of communicating. I think there's so I think that's why kind of interdisciplinary approaches are really important.
He was a master of communication.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot there.
Thanks, Joanna. Yep.
So thank you for your presentation. That was great. I was wondering if there are, or what are the resources that currently exist for individuals to seek recourse from algorithmic or data harm, if any do exist, other than these mobilizations or these going to lawyers? Is there anything else for individuals?
I was thinking that I should have. I was thinking today that I should have had another slide or a follow-up link. So because I do have a list of organizations that I turn to for information and that provide tools that are really useful. So I don't know how I would get that to you, but maybe, is there a way to do a follow-up?
I think when we post the video, perhaps we could have resources listed underneath it. That could be one option.
And if you want to give me your, or if you want to email me, I can send you what I've got. So, I mean, just a few off the top of my head. There's Tactical Tech. So Tactical Tech is a European-based organization, but they've been doing some fantastic work, and also some tools that people can use. There's the Electronic Frontier Foundation. There's also Privacy International that have some fantastic resources. The Office of the Privacy Commissioner federally has some fantastic resources as well. And I will look up some more. Yeah, but I think that I'm happy to share the resources that I have. Yeah, no problem.
Other questions? Got just a bit more time. Not seeing any, so unless there are any, I'm going to ask one question of you. I'll abuse my privilege. I'm a health professor, and often when we look at AI interventions and concerns in health, we think about, diagnostics, surgery, maybe the case of home care. We don't often think about the issues in criminal justice that might be exacerbated here that have health effects for populations down the line. And I guess my question about the looking at the data harm record, I like the shift from looking at from risks to harms because it's less speculative. But is there a worry that we start to maybe undercount or underestimate the harms because harms compound in many different ways that perhaps we don't count and measure, and we might then point to the record and say, look, the harms aren't as bad as we once thought, where perhaps the risks might tell more of a story there. So just curious to hear your thoughts on that, Joanna. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And one of the things that we've been thinking about and talking about is the way that people are affected in multiple ways by different kinds of systems, right? So even the way of talking about this, as I presented it today, is limited because I'm not suggesting, but the way that I'm conveying this information is I'm talking about one type of harm, another type of harm, another type of harm, right? And the more that these systems get implemented all around us, people are negatively affected by multiple systems potentially, and so harm is compounded in different ways, and different people depending on who they are, depending on the kind of opportunities afforded to them, depending on the way in which they experience or don't discrimination or injustice, that will affect the extent to which there are compounded or intersecting kinds of harm. And I think that there's also, I'm not saying it's not important to talk about risk, right? I think that talking about risk is important. I guess my issue is that that's all everybody talks about, and most of the if you look at government, if you look at the initial ethical frameworks by governments, if you look at the way that corporations talk about any of these issues, I mean the discourse of risk is so pervasive. That's what I was trying to do with the data harm record, and there's even if you look at reporting on this issue, very seldom is there something that's very concrete, right? Like we're doing a media analysis now of hundreds and hundreds of articles over the last year, and it's very rare to find a story that talks about someone's concrete experience. It's not because the harms are not occurring. I mean, look at millions and millions of data breaches, like millions and millions of people affected by data breaches, right? But it's just because there's not a lot of focus on talking about harm. So, but I agree. Thinking about risk does provide us with a way of future thinking, which is important. I'm not saying future thinking is not important. I suppose I'm just trying to be a little bit provocative here and say, hold on, wait a second, let's look at now, right? Yeah. Great.
Well, thank you, Joanna. Before I ask you to help me in thanking Joanna, I'll remind you of two things. One, we have one more session in this series next Thursday, same place, same time, where we'll be talking about trustworthiness in AI, and that'll be a panel discussion. And the other reminder is that this video will be put online on the Rotman's website, so please do check that out later in the year. Please help me in thanking Joanna Redden for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.